When we're navigating people through deals, a lot of the coaching we have to do with our sellers really is explaining. It can be like a bucket of cold water over your face if you are across the Zoom screen from a public accounting firm doing a quality of earnings engagement. Accountants don't typically make their money on their sparkling personalities. They're there to do a job, but without the coaching and knowledge of what's going on, just that stark contrast of converting from getting to the letter of intent to all of a sudden talking to people paid to verify results and run an audit process on you, it can feel very invasive.
Welcome to the Deal Factory, sponsored and powered by 3PG Advisors. I'm in studio today, your host, Jeff Harkness, with Gloria Palmer. Gloria is a co-founder and president of Source Expert Advisors, our buy-side and investor platform. She's also been a longtime leader on the 3PG side, one of our senior leaders on our sell-side business. So, Gloria, welcome back. Part two in the studio. We're going to continue our conversation around this being an investor or being a buyer concept. And we're going to dig a little bit deeper on three major parts of what I would call the buy-side deal cycle. So thanks again for being in.
Thank you, Jeff.
So I want to start with, I'm putting my investor hat on. And you and I talk about this a lot. When I put an investor hat on, I'm looking for a return. I want to go out and acquire a platform. I want to go ahead and put tuck-ins, additional acquisitions into that platform. And to use some simple metrics, let's just say my initial platform is 2 to 3 million in EBITDA. And then through acquisition and organic growth, I'm trying to grow that platform to somewhere in the 15 to 20 to $25 million range. And given your background as a CPA, you and I run into a lot of different challenges that we have to navigate, again, if we have our investor buy hat on. So let's start with this. 3 simple concepts. 1, how do we win more deals in a room? If I'm, again, looking to acquire that platform in a specific vertical. 2 is time kills deals. So speed to close. The more efficient that I could be in my due diligence process, the more efficient I could be in coaching and managing not only my own vendors, but also the seller and their advisors. That could make or break whether or not we're successful or avoid the retrading concept. And then 3, and this is important, we've talked about this at length, integration is hard. What happens once the deal is closed and signed? And remember, a lot of times we have investors that are really good deal people, and then suddenly we have to pivot to things like organic growth, integration of the back office, the systems, the technology, et cetera. So we're going to deep dive for the audience in all 3 of those. Let's back up and let's really start with a simple concept that you and I chuckle about, and that is connecting with a seller in a room. So do you want to maybe give a few examples, or we can talk together about speaking entrepreneur? That's the term that we use, and how we think investors and buyers at times can fail miserably on really trying to connect with the seller. So talk about that if you would.
Well, the first thing that comes to mind are just the difference in experience that these two groups have. If you have the founder and entrepreneur people, and then you have the buyer or the investors, and really how they're looking at the situation at hand. To the entrepreneur and founder, this business they've created is likely a huge part of themselves, their family, their identity. I mean, blood, sweat, and tears they've sacrificed to grow this thing. And the people that work in that business are extremely important to them. This is not just something they're looking at a piece of paper or numbers on a spreadsheet. This is a living, breathing, live, important thing to them. And then if you get in a room with somebody who looks at it or appears to look at it in a cold and calculated, neutral way, looking just at numbers, seemingly not caring about everything that entrepreneur does, that can create a huge lack of chemistry, lack of trust, and just frankly, it could be a situation where maybe everything else lines up, but that business owner does not want to work with that potential investor just because they sense these people don't take it serious and they're not really going to take care of my company.
Yeah, it's really well said. I think a lot of times buyers and investors, because it is their profession and they do so many deals in the course of the years, they become a little bit coarse,
calloused,
right, to the emotions that sellers had. Like you said, like, hey, this is my baby. I've never done this before. I have fear. I don't know who to trust. How are you different? And we've had some fun with this. Oftentimes after hosting a series of management meetings, you and I'll step back and we'll say, hey, who sucked in a room today, right? What group was exceptional and who sucked in the room? And there's always time, Gloria, to get into due diligence mode. There's always time to step back and start throwing out the different acronyms. Multiples on invested EBITDA. What is EBITDA? Working capital, organic growth. My favorite is 5-year CAGR. 5-year CAGR. People don't even know what that is. Hey, I'm a landscaper. I'm a tree guy. I don't know what that means. And we've even caught glances from our sellers, our clients, where they look over to us and say, I don't have a clue what they're talking about. And I'm a little bit fearful of raising my hand because I don't want to look dumb and say, hey, I'm not quite sure that I'm following you. So I think that it's always interesting in the best platforms with the best leaders that they enter the room not in due diligence mode, but they enter a room to try and emotionally connect with the seller and create some trust and rapport. And at the same time, try and articulate, how are we different? Because, Gloria, when's the last time you've talked to a seller, you got your buyer and investor hat on, and the first thing the seller's saying is, I'm getting blown up every single day with emails and phone calls. I don't know who to trust. I don't know if I'm ready. But really that initial meeting is more about an emotional connection and the ability to articulate a vision than it is to get in due diligence mode. And so don't you think that we just see too much due diligence in those first meetings? Because again, I'm a professional investor.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And to your point, we do talk to our business owners and their phones are getting blown up. They're getting offers in the mail. There's so much communication to them that there are people interested. And when an investor approaches a meeting and jumps into due diligence first, they're conveying that essentially the seller, you got to prove it to me, where really it's the investor that has to prove to the seller that they're essentially worthy of being part of that consideration.
Yeah.
And investors just jumping in like that, it could be seen very disrespectful. And also you mentioned about jumping in with acronyms. When I talk to business owners, when we have investors or people in that field start talking, not speaking in concepts that everyone would understand or not explaining, the business owner feels talked down to. And you're really not going to make a good relationship and have good rapport if one party feels like they're being talked down to.
Yeah. And I think, again, there's a simplicity, at least in the skilled trades world, of, hey, I started as a technician. I've built a really good business. I care about my people. I care about my customers. I don't want to make a mistake. But at the same time, I don't really understand the world of private equity and investors. Who do I trust?
Mm-hmm.
And I think the more that being on the buy side that you can go in and create trust and rapport. And remember, a lot of times you're sitting in a room, and we talk about this as well. We have great young talent on our team, both at 3PG Advisors and on the source side. A lot of times if I'm a 50, 60-year-old person, male or female, sitting in a room, and here comes three folks from the investment world, and they're all under the age of 35, there's still that emotion of, I hear that you just raised $500 million, but you've never sweated a payroll in your life. Like, why should I believe or trust that we're going to go out and do something special together? So it's really important to focus on that. And I think too many times people take that first meeting for granted. Mm-hmm. Let me add this, and then we'll kind of move on to this concept of time kills deals. I'm a big proponent. Well, let me ask you, are you a big proponent of when you come in as a investor, taking the time to go to dinner, break bread, connect a little bit on a personal level with some commonalities with friends and families and hobbies? Doesn't that make a difference?
I think it does. I think that's good after an initial meeting, just to get to know each other in a semi-professional scenario where you are building that rapport before you jump into something like dinner, because that can be, a lot of times when you're at a dinner table, not everybody can hear and talk at the same time. Yeah. So if it's afterwards and you've already been in a situation where everybody can see and hear from everybody, I think that's a very good idea.
And I like a couple things out of the playbook. So I'm coming in, I'm the buyer investor, I'm coming in for the first time. I want to have that initial meeting. I want to connect in a room. I want to speak entrepreneur. I want to separate myself. And then that meeting subsides. We go to dinner, continue the conversation. I'm also a fan of, if you can do it from a time perspective, to maybe go by the facility after. Certainly a lot of entrepreneurs, under the veil of confidentiality, it's why we don't do it during business hours, but get a chance to take a look at the facility, maybe even at some point in that initial first 3 to 4 hours, maybe look at a couple properties, again, to kind of break the ice and connect emotionally. I think it goes a long way on winning more deals.
I would agree. And I almost feel like that might be an even bigger test of the investor, is if they're actually walking through the facility, seeing how the business is actually run, the offices the people are actually working in, going on the actual properties that are being serviced, just their knowledge, their respect, how they treat everybody. I think that that's a great way for a seller to see, really, how does this investor, who to them thinks they probably just work in an office, perhaps have never had a manual labor job in their life,
Yep.
How are they going to work? How are they going to react to this type of situation?
Yeah, fantastic. All right, so let's move on to, again, just to remind the audience, one is, how do we win more deals? And let's assume in our scenario that we're talking about that we were good in a room, we were able to build rapport, come to an agreement in terms and economics, and we've signed a letter of intent. Now what happens that maybe the investor or buyer underappreciates, and what the seller has no idea what's coming, and that's the due diligence work stream. So talk about those areas and just things that you and I use the concept in our Source Expert business around Navigator. There's an absence of a navigator for that seller because, again, they've never done this. And oftentimes the advisors that they surround themselves as well. So talk about the navigator concept.
Yeah. When a deal kicks off after a letter of intent, as you said, usually due diligence is what happens next. And up until this point, typically the business owner has only interacted with the investor themselves. Likely, the next introduction they're going to get is the investor's quality of earnings team, who are a bunch of public accountants.
Here comes the root canal. Here comes the proctology exam. Here comes, at times, and I know you're a CPA, maybe not a lot of personality in the room. The salespeople have exited, and here comes the professionals. And I always laugh. I want you to say this. I know I'm getting off script here, but how often have we coached sellers where we say, look, if there's silence on the other end, they're just crunching numbers and thinking about the next question. You don't have to feel. It's a very different vibe, right? When you get the series of professionals in versus those initial investors and deal folks. So I didn't mean to cut you off and go down a tangent, but here we go.
Yeah. No, I mean, when we're navigating people through deals, a lot of the coaching we have to do with our sellers really is explaining, because even if everything went well up to LOI, it can be like, a bucket of cold water over your face if you are across the Zoom screen from a public accounting firm doing a quality of earnings engagement.
Yep.
And I always joke, accountants don't typically make their money on their sparkling personalities.
They don't.
So and they're there to do a job, but without the coaching and knowledge of what's going on, just that stark contrast of converting from getting to the letter of intent, which can be kind of a collaborative sales type process, to all of a sudden talking to people paid to verify results and run an audit like process on you. It can feel very abrasive and invasive. And it's not just the quality of earnings providers. Other third parties will come in. Environmental people will come in, perhaps human resources people, labor practices. Some of these diligence streams, perhaps the investor will have internal people that handle it. But a lot of times they're third-party consultants that come in. Yep. And those people may or may not be personable, may or may not be respectful, may or may not know how to work with a business owner who is trying to run a business, knows their business, but is all of a sudden being thrown into the largest audit-type process that they've likely ever been into.
Yeah, it's well said. I think that smart investors are never going to undervalue the communication of talking to that seller on why something is happening. I think they take that for granted. And you and I discussed this at length. I believe that the best investors can communicate in a manner that says, look, here's why we're doing something, or here's why we're asking for this information. But also, in fairness to, the CPA, the auditor, the benefits specialist, the environmental consultant, the attorneys, they're all being paid to write a report, an independent report that they need to take a position on. And so we like to communicate with sellers in this, hey, we're your navigator concept of not only why something is being asked, but the frequency at which they're asked the same question 3 and 4 or 5 times. And most sellers don't understand the element of the human emotion says, hey, Gloria, you've asked that question to me 5 times. Aren't you all talking together? I'm starting to get offended that I've answered that question, and it's apparent that you don't think that my time is important enough that you guys can talk amongst yourself because I've already answered that question. The reality of it is somebody hasn't explained to that seller and that entrepreneur that that is intentional. Legal counsel needs to write their own independent report and ask those questions. The quality of earnings team has to ask those questions. The benefits provider, et cetera, et cetera. And so when we see deal fatigue And deal fatigue is real, particularly in the skilled trades world, where I'm not sure if everybody shows up tomorrow. Like, I'm running a full-time business and it's go time. In that skilled trades world, once you get into this sequencing of professional advisors and audit and due diligence, fatigue is real. Man, Gloria, how many times have we seen diligence request lists that have the same, forget the question, but they haven't spent time looking at all of it. Everything's just boilerplate. And it takes extra time from that seller just to navigate through, hey, here's the same request 3 times. I'm not talking about answering the question, just the duplication. Isn't that real? And in the best deals that we've been through, folks begin as an investor and a buyer to consolidate their deal docs, to consolidate their request list. Isn't that a better strategy than boilerplate? And I get the veil of fiduciary responsibility, but haven't we seen some real doozies just on hundreds and hundreds of pages of duplicate requests? And all it does is kill time and frustrate the seller.
That's exactly what we'll see. Some groups will line up the requests, and they'll be noted that this is a duplicate request or will fulfill items on other request lists. But usually that's something we have to do. You got to keep in mind just the volume of requests that come in. These lists will typically come in either in Word or Excel, and you could be given one at a time or you could get them all at once. But you're going to end up with, in the end, 5, 6, even more of them. And most business owners have not encountered an information gathering exercise to that level. And there's varying levels of the skill set in just consuming and organizing and tackling something like that.
Yeah. What have you seen with sellers and their professional advisors? Typically, there's a CPA and a tax person. There's an attorney. How have you been able to navigate with a seller and coordinate being efficient with those third-party advisors, knowing that, man, how many times have you heard that, the attorney blew up the deal, or we couldn't get through, the quality of earnings audit because, we don't have an audited statement, or we don't have a good person working with the seller to be able to pull that stuff. Should you be intentional if you're an investor or buyer in directing a little bit that seller to make sure they got the right people around them?
I mean, unfortunately, sometimes the existing attorney and existing accountant to a seller may feel like through the diligence process, honestly, their work is being challenged too. And just depending on if these advisors are familiar with the deal process or with deals, some of them actually act very counterproductive because it almost feels like their turf is being invaded. The best ones are ones that are seasoned and have been through many deals, because they're able to quickly identify, here's the areas that are mine, and these are the ones I can answer. When we're advising in a Navigator type of engagement, our experience can identify where the areas that really would be under the purview of those external advisors versus not. Because what you don't want to do is just give a huge list to somebody who's inexperienced and who is billing you by the hour.
Yeah.
So
yeah. And I think that's well said in coaching the client. We've had to spend time with sellers helping them really work through the, at times, lack of sophistication or just the raw time commitment with some of the third parties that sellers say, hey, I want to come on board. And I think if you're a really good investor and on the buy side, you're trying to identify that on the front end. because it could change the approach. How many times is it's like, what's the definition of insanity? Keep doing the same thing and expecting a different result. So I think it's real. And so we're big believers in that Navigator concept where someone needs to help guide the seller through that process. And we find that most investors and buyer groups take that to advantage. And again, in our opinion, it leads to less deals getting closed, deal fatigue. And again, as I've said it 3 times, to the audience, time kills deals. Mm-hmm. So that makes sense. All right, great. So going back to it, number 1 is, hey, how do we win more deals? Number 2 is time kills deals. Let's look at speed to close. Doesn't mean that we're not being productive in diligence, but how do we move forward in an efficient manner and close within that 90, 60, you're already shaking your head. Like we've done things in 30 days.
Oh,
You
yeah.
and I have done some things in 30 days. That is quick, but that 60, 90-day time horizon, and there's nothing better than being an investor and going back to your partners in your IC committee and saying, hey, we're right on schedule for closing. And again, there's, I think, a lot of lessons in that Navigator concept. All right, so let's pivot to integration.
Post-close.
And post-close, we signed the LOI, we got through due diligence and closed. Now we're excited. Talk about the transition that you've seen happen where deal guys tend to focus on deals, and then who else comes in as part of that buyer team on integration. Just talk through some of the things that you've seen there that have created big disconnects post-close.
After close, when we get communications from sellers, the negative ones can be from integration, communication to employees, things perhaps changing and jobs changing, different scenarios that you cannot guarantee lack of change, but you can be better at communicating, is what I'll say. The other thing specifically in the back office, a big change, typically you have an organization that's joining a larger one, or you have an organization that's a platform that's taking on an investor. The amount of data that is going to be requested from that business is likely going to be much higher, and the speed of which is going to be much faster. And this is an additional burden that's placed on that business that's trying to navigate through all of the other changes that are going on post-close. Something that is helpful from the investor is support during that time and communication and clarification, and not just mandates for information. It's something, again, the investor wants the information because they're trying to do their job,
Yep.
but they have to see it through the eyes of the entrepreneur and the business owner and the people actually running the business of everything that's going on. Too much of that could have a detriment to the actual operations of the business and detract from it. And you said a focus post-close could be on even more deals. And we do know that PE and investors, they want to grow through acquisition. I mean, that's a good thing. But that activity and ignoring things that would go into the organic growth piece of the business, that is something that is just as important, if not more so, because growth just through acquisition without proving out that you can do the organic growth and actually run and generate a cohesive company, that's not as strong of an organization, and that's not what ultimately is going to build value in the organization.
Yeah, well said. I think there's a lot of fear post-close within the owner rank or the seller ranks, their people, and I think there's euphoria on closing a deal in a timely manner. And then some panic and some worry sets in about communication. We've had a lot of sellers stand up and have to address their team and talk about why. And there's been no collaboration from their investor or buyer. So I'm a big fan, and you and I preach this, that you start to get to the last 10 days before closing your deal, really beginning to focus on with your seller and soon to be your new partner or your new platform, what's the communication plan? How are we going to communicate to our employees? How are we going to check in and check their temperature? What are we going to get from, and I think buyers and investors, particularly investors, because like you said, we're kind of on to the next deal. Let's do the first tuck-in. I think they undervalue how many people come at the seller's people. So you got the vendor saying, hey, I heard you sold. It's going to suck. You got headhunters that get wind of deals that are now calling employees and saying, hey, we heard you that you were just acquired. Are you interested in coming over and making a change? You have the human emotion with people saying, hey, am I getting a new boss? Is my paycheck going to change? Do I have to go home to my spouse and explain that we might have to look at some different doctors, or our health insurance deductible is going to change? And what we find as advising investors and buyers, sometimes they take that for granted. The amount of fear, the amount of communication, the amount of people that are going to come whisper in employees and leaders' ears to say, hey, it's not going to go well. But it feels like there's always a concept with a buyer that says, well, we have a 100-day plan. How many times have you and I heard, here's the 100-day plan? And it's basically a checklist in Excel that, remember, we just came out of due diligence. The last thing that I want to see as a seller is one more freaking checklist, right? But I think it is important, if you're going to do anything on the front end, alignment and communication is a must. And then will you speak to just alignment in systems, alignment in payroll and back office? Talk about some of the things there that you got to get right. And we still find, I'll give an example. We have a client down in the Florida market that called and said, hey, you were right. Do you remember that?
Mm-hmm.
And it came down to what? It came down to, hey, I was interpreting what this new hire process was going to look like, and what actually happened in the new hire process didn't line up with what I'm thinking. So if we're a good integrator post-close, how are you thinking about systems? How are you thinking about communication within that first 1 to 3 days, first week, first month?
Well, the businesses that we're talking about in field service, facility maintenance, skilled trades, the employees are the most important thing. I mean, we're literally selling labor.
Yep.
So to me, any integration that directly affects the employees is probably number one. So you touched on payroll and benefits. It can seem like an afterthought, but if there's a proposal to change somebody's health insurance where they might have to pick different doctors, that's a real big thing to people.
People quit over that.
Yeah. If you're going to change a payroll period and there's going to be some sort of transition, not thoughtfully planning that out and communicating it that's just a recipe for disaster. And as you said, once word gets out that there's a transition of some kind, people look for that to poach people.
Yeah.
That's something recruiters look for.
Yeah. I told you.
Why do they look for it? Because they know it usually, a lot of times it goes wrong.
Happen. Yeah.
And even if it goes right, people are still kind of people don't like change in general. So in the best of scenarios, but you got to do everything you can to make that transition as transparent and smooth as you can. And I think a lot of that too is you have to be talking to the seller themselves ahead of time and taking advice from them too, because they know their business, they know their people.
Yep. The
timing and how things are communicated, there has to be coordination. It can't just come down from on high and the former business owner is completely unaware. I think it's so important how that's handled in the communication.
Yeah, I think it's really well said. I think sometimes the customer part of it is significantly easier. A lot of customers, management companies, whatever it may be, they're being acquired too. And most customers, they ask one simple question: am I going to get the same people servicing my account? Am I going to have the same account manager? So they're looking at it not they got a different set of goggles on. It's like, hey, am I going to get the same people regardless of the brand on the side of the truck? Whereas the culture that exists with employees, the importance and the love of branding, the benefits, the pay periods and paychecks, sometimes again, it's undervalued or it's just jammed through, and that leads to people being unhappy. And by the way, the great integrators don't just tell you and communicate what's going to happen. They actually show up with true actions. People don't care, particularly if I'm a little fearful about what this deal is going to look like for me and my family post-close. I'm really going to just watch and see what happens. And if you tell me, oh my gosh, this just came into my head, nothing's going to change. Nothing's going to change. If I could just punch people that say nothing is going to change if I'm an investor or buyer, there is an element of business as usual, but we're continuing to see a lack of communication. And I'll close with this on integration, Gloria. I get that there's timelines. I get that there's investors and accountability. I also think that the best investors are humble. They actually come in not trying to be Superman and actually value some collaborative feedback. And there's a fine line with that. A lot of times, I think on integration, your owner could be the biggest challenge to integration, your former seller, or your best confidant, because they understand what's happening and what's expected of them moving forward. And I think sometimes, that gets glossed over doing that. All right. So I want to close with this because we've been spending time with this investor buy-side mentality. And most of the skilled trades that are out there are a number of folks that say, hey, I'm ready to go execute. But in order to build enterprise value, create a significant return, there's three fundamentals that we feel like probably don't get focused on enough. And that is, one, connecting and speaking entrepreneurs with sellers in the room. Two is to be able to help in a Navigator concept, prepare and prep not only the buy-side advisors, but that seller and their advisors to officially work through the due diligence process. And it's overwhelming on how difficult that is. And again, time kills deals. And then third, and we're seeing this a lot in the skilled trades world, we're seeing what? Integration failures, poor communication, arrogance, lack of prep on the front end, even before you get to days 1 through 3. We still have a lot of investors and buyers that don't have a strategy around how they're going to integrate culture and employees. They've made promises to maybe some of their benefits professionals. Hey, take a look at all this insurance stuff. Tell me what the problem is. And hey, we'll take a look at getting that business over to you. So it'll be interesting, given the volume of deals that we're seeing in the niche, more stories coming out around lack of integration expertise, platforms slowing down in their ability to win deals, and certainly looking at the timeline at which you can sign a letter of intent and close. Mm-hmm. And so thank you for spending more time with us here today and your expertise. You've had a front row seat for a lot of years on what it takes to navigate to the closing table, and you know how much I appreciate you. So thanks for joining us in studio today, and thank you to the audience. We'll see everybody soon.
Thank you.